Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for being here. It is Sunday, January 24th, and it is various time zones of Design Justice members joining us from different parts of the world. We're really excited to have you here today. More people might filter in as we move along, don't worry, I will be taking care of that. But thank you so much for being here on this Sunday with us all. My name's Victoria. I am based in Toronto, Ontario, which is the land of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabeg, Mississaugas of the First Credit Nation, Mississauga, and Huron-Wendat. And we always try to start our meetings by acknowledging the land that we're on. We also recognize that it's not always the most wholesome by just doing the acknowledgement, but we encourage people to look up where the land that they're on. And today we are at the Design Justice Member Story Sharing Session. This is our second session that we've done, and hopefully more people within the Design Justice Network will continue to want to tell people their stories. But today we will have Lesley and Noel, who will be sharing some stories with us today. And these are just informal sessions where people, members from the network, can talk about how their work interacts with design justice, how it's using the principles, how they first engaged with design justice in general, and just an open space for members to be able to kind of talk to each other, share their stories. So today I'm really excited and really happy to introduce our speaker, Lesley Ann Noel. Dr. Lesley Ann Noel is an associate director for design thinking for social impact and a professor of practice at the Phyllis M. Taylor Center for Social Innovation and Design Thinking at Tulane University. She's also the co-chair of the Pluriversal Design Special Interest Group with the Design Research Society. Dr. Lesley Ann Noel designed a deck of cards, the Designer's Critical Alphabet, which is available for purchase, to introduce designers and design students to critical theory and to help them reflect on their design processes. Each of the cards introduces a theory under that particular letter. So without further ado, you can keep introducing yourselves in the chat, but I will introduce Lesley and Noel.
Thank you, Victoria. Hi, everybody. And I'm going to start sharing my screen, which is not always, I'm always kind of divided. Like, do we go straight into share screen or do we talk first? Because, we can actually see each other better if we start off talking. But I'm going to share my screen so that my screen can help keep me on track a bit. Victoria, thanks for the land acknowledgement. I was able to, in like 2 minutes, actually pull up a land acknowledgement that we use here in New Orleans, because we are on this space of that was originally belonged to other people. And so some of the tribes here or ethnic groups here in New Orleans were the Chitimaca, the Tunica Biloxi tribes of Louisiana Choctaw tribe, the Jena Band of Choctaw Indians, Clifton Choctaw Apache of the Ibab, the Adai Caddo tribe, Four Winds tribe, Louisiana Cherokee, the Grand Caillou Dulac Band, Ile de Jean Charles Band, Puerto Chien Indian tribe, and the United Houma Nation, and finally the Atacapa Ishak Nation of Louisiana. For me, it's exciting being here in Louisiana, and challenging, and maybe we'll talk about some of this stuff. We only have an hour together, so maybe we won't. But I put together like 3,000 slides for 10 minutes of talk. So let's see where we get, right? So I start everything talking about positionality. And it actually is one of the cards in the deck. So positionality, in case you don't know, is the practice of the researcher delineating their own position in relation to a context, a research context. I learned about doing this in my qualitative research, where as I was doing my research, I had to reflect on the fact that, okay, I was a Black woman, a parent, someone from the Caribbean, wanting to do research with Black children in the Caribbean. And so I had to, in writing my own positionality statement, I had to think about, okay, what actually was my own agenda in doing the research that I was doing. And now I start every single class, every project, having people talk about positionality so that we could figure out, okay, what are our agendas here? So my own positionality, I am from the Caribbean, from a tiny dot in the middle of nowhere. It barely appears on a world map. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I lived in Brazil for 6 years, and those 6 years might not even seem like such a long time. Maybe the point of my life when I went to Brazil that has played a big role then in my positionality. And I only moved to the United States in 2015, which means that I had a good long, about 15 years of practice without having to feel a major influence from Uncle Sam. And so I think that that also affects the way that I do the work that I do. And, then in quotes, as an older professional coming into the space, I'm able to challenge things in a way that I might not have been able to if I moved here like to do undergrad and I stayed at that time, So I'm kind of like in a space where, kind of like I'll use an expletive, no fucks to give. I'm kind of like at that stage where, this is my position and I'm not afraid. I'm not, you can send me home if you want, so I'm wearing my revolutionary hat today. And that's good because it gives me space to challenge things. I draw this slide every now and again because sometimes people are like, okay, well, who is this woman to tell us anything? I've been connected to education for way too long. And I've started and stopped many programs, dropped out of stuff over maybe the course of 30 years. But for me, I guess the most significant part of my positionality here is that I started off in industrial design at UFPE in Brazil. And then I taught at the University of the West Indies for 15 years. So that gives me a pretty different point of view, right? I actually I didn't finish a year at Stanford. I spent most of a year in that place. And that also affects the way that I do my work. And right now I'm at Tulane University in New Orleans, where I have that very, very long title, which sometimes means nothing, okay? But it's sometimes interesting because it means that, yes, the best part of the title that I have is that social impact is part of my title. And it means that it forces us to think about, okay, does any of the work that we do make any sense? And unfortunately, sometimes we think about it and we realize that actually, no, it doesn't. We say we're doing these things and we're not actually making impact. And, that can be a little bit sad and upsetting and whatnot. But that is actually, I like the accountability in the title. All right, so I have like 7 minutes to talk, I think, or maybe even less. I like to show this quote at the start of everything I do, which is about, it is about emancipatory framing, until the lion has his or her own storyteller, the hunter will always have the best part of the story. And then this was the philosophy that I took into my PhD work, where it was about creating then a child-centered perspective on design education, and not just child-centered. I worked with rural children in Trinidad. So it was like, how do I take this kind of emancipatory position in design education and not make it about this outsider coming in and saying, this is how you have to do design, getting children to say, these are the methods that we want to use in design. And so in the work that I did, I asked the kids these questions throughout the workshop. What is wrong? Giving them space to critique the space that we were in. Where do we want to go? Where I was asking them to imagine what a better space, a better city, a better school, a better Trinidad, what that looked like. And then through design, this is where the design part came in. How can our dreams become reality? So we had a lot of discussion first about the what is wrong and where do we want to go. And then the design part came later on, as they designed ways to get to where they wanted to go. And I started doing that in my PhD, but I've drawn that into, I've continued that in everything that I do. And a lot of what I do is, in fact, influenced by Paulo Freire and people who were influenced by him. So I don't actually refer to Paulo Freire a lot in what I've written. I refer more to somebody called Ira Shaw, who was influenced by Paulo Freire. It's just that Ira Shaw's work, he wrote something called a book called Empowering Education. And I think that he gives us some principles that are really easy to follow and put into our own work. So that's some of the political stuff that's driving this work. This is one of the papers that came out of the work. Actually was published in Canada, introducing critical pedagogy through design thinking to primary school students in Trinidad and Tobago. And, I put like these two questions up. Where I saw the work was starting to have impact is the children, by the third week, they started to ask these questions because we use like the newspapers in discussing, before we started the design challenge, we discussed things that we'd look through the newspapers. And then one child said, oh, but this newspaper is just filled up in international stories and there aren't stories about people like us. I was like, yay, we're getting somewhere. And then another child looked at the materials that we were using. We were using modeling clay, which we call plasticine. And the child said, well, the child actually picked up the box and started to look and say, well, everything around us is made in China. Can't we make some of this stuff here? And again, I was like, yeah, we're getting somewhere because I'm trying to get people in the things that we do, and in the way that I teach, I'm trying to get people to ask questions, to actually question everything around us. All right. So a few papers came out of that. I started calling what I do critical design thinking, where I'm drawing the critical from a few places, critical pedagogy, critical inquiry, critical theory, critical thinking, and critique. And I use these tools, in this critical design thinking, I use tools to help keep me accountable. And this is probably more tied to design justice. Like I used to use this actual word, like a Mad Lib. I'm committed to the success and empowerment of whatever group. And then by doing XYZ, I don't do these things anymore because I've built a bit of a muscle to make sure that I'm keeping myself accountable. But this other one was something that I used to use, where I was challenging myself to actually see how the work that I was doing was shifting power. Because I used to do a lot of work in development, with development agencies, and I used to get very frustrated that I felt that the work that I was doing had no impact. And so now I keep asking myself these questions along the way. And I think it makes me more accountable, and that's useful. All right, so finally, maybe like in the last minute, we got to the cards. And so the cards are born out of this kind of activity of asking questions. And the backstory of the cards is that I was teaching at the D School at Stanford, and I was really struck one day when the students had to choose who they were going to design for. And like I said, they didn't do anything wrong. I mean, that's the kind of prompt that I always give students, but they ended up all choosing to design for like the same kind of target group, right? Which, I mean, we all probably know that I was in California, they would choose to design for white males, maybe in their 20s or 30s, what we kind of call the tech bro. And so I really was disturbed by that, and then started to create a whole lot of tools to try to get people to ask more questions. So the deck and the app, because there's an app, and I'll put the link to the app in the chat. So the deck and the app, these are like the end of a road of many experiments I was trying to do throughout a period of time to help students to see difference a little bit more and maybe to see things that might have been a little bit more problematic that they weren't seeing. So like this was an earlier version of the cards where this is actually the version of cards that I took into the classroom when I saw that the students weren't they didn't see anything. The students and my colleagues didn't see anything wrong with the fact that all six of our groups were designing for white men, right? And you know, like one of my colleagues actually said, well, they just asked who they knew, and that's true, and that's actually how a lot of us work. It's just that I had never been in a space where if people just ask who they know, the end result is that everybody's going to design for young white men. You know, I've been in different spaces where it would be okay for you to just ask who you know, because the class itself is much more mixed. We'd get different results. And so that was the first time that I actually had to consciously think about, oh, we have to design in ways to make sure that people remember many other groups. All right, so I'm just going to take like maybe 1 or 2 minutes and quickly go through some other experiments. So the deck of cards that exists might not even have been the best deck of cards, because I had this other deck of cards that I actually thought that the second one was the better one, and the second one never made it out into the world, because and this is about like institutions and ownership. So the second one probably belongs to the D school, and the D school didn't make it public, whereas the first one belongs to me. And I actually created the listing on Etsy so that a friend of mine could get them. And I never took the listing down, you know, whereas the second one, we've had to go through all of these discussions and, you know, and it's okay, actually. You know, it's okay that the second one hasn't been public, but this is the second one. I made this tool about connection because someone told me, some people at Stanford who were working in resilience were saying that, so like now I live in New Orleans, they were saying that the biggest predictor for success after Hurricane Katrina was actually about how many people you knew, not actually about your economic status or intellectual status or something like that. So I've made a lot of my classes about connecting with people and relationships, because apparently that's really, really important for your success, right? And not something that people think about in design. I brought in like a lot of games and stuff like that into the classes that I teach. SpiderMan Into the Spider-Verse, I think, was like the most amazing movie because it shows pluriversality in action. You know, we see this spider story from so many points of view. And, you know, like when I talk about this in class, when I used to, it resonated with people. Now it's a bit of an older reference, but I'll find a way of bringing it back in. You know, so a lot of what I do is about like multiple perspectives and kind of breaking up this American European hegemony in design. So I'm a little revolutionary sometimes. When I was inside of the D School, I was also creating things that were kind of subversive, so the D School talks about 8 abilities. And then I would ask people, well, what's the 9th ability? You know, and ask people to brainstorm about that. Or I'd say, well, okay, well, this is the empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test. But if you had to change this, what would you do? And this actually has become an activity that I continue in all of my classes, where I ask people to redraw, redefine what they think, you know, to actually be very, very critical of all of the design thinking models that exist, and then design something new. And let's see. So this positionality wheel, a lot of people have seen, because I think that people have to learn to talk about positionality, to talk about race, stuff like that. So this is available for download on my website somewhere. You have to go in and dig up a little bit and you'll find it. And then I created this class at the D School that was completely subversive, where we partnered with some people at a business school in Trinidad where I used to teach. And then my colleague and I, who taught the class, we designed the class. The students didn't actually know this, but we designed the class so that the students in Trinidad had more power than the students in California. And the students in Trinidad had to diagnose the power of the problem of the students in California. So we created the class like that, where we flipped the way the class was designed. And I think that I can probably stop here. I mean, I probably have like 6,000 more slides, but I can, let me see. Yeah, I could give you all a break now. Oh, actually, no, one last thing. I'm working on methods around public health. So that's something that you could look out for. I'm working on an exciting project with a colleague who's a doctor. No, she's not a medical doctor. She's also a PhD. But we are working in public health about creating methods, design methods to help people in public health do community research using like community engaged design practice. So I'm going to stop sharing now and see if people want to ask questions, talk, or whatever Victoria wants us to do.
Well, so I was just going to ask the group. So what I'm going to do is split you into smaller rooms just for 10 minutes. There is a Google Jamboard for everyone if you would like to use, and I'm going to show it super quickly so that you can see. But you'll go into the Google Jamboard. I just pasted the link in the chat. So you'll click that link and you'll go to the slide corresponding with the breakout room that you'll be in just a second. And I'm just going to quickly share my screen to show you how to use this in case you have never used it before, just to make sure everybody feels comfortable. So this is what the Google Jamboard looks like. Up at the top, there's 4 questions that you can talk about, discuss, and there's a link here. If you copy it, it takes you back to the session outline, and that's where you can type some questions for Lesley if you want to. And I can help facilitate those questions after, or folks can just ask them out loud. So if I was in group number 4, there's about 4 breakout rooms. I just slide up at the top to the number corresponding with the breakout room. And then you can type notes by clicking a sticky here and type in something. As soon as you click save, it shows up on here and you can move them around. I'll delete that. There's also just a regular text box like this, and you can type in anything you want. You don't have to use it. It's just there as a guide. So hopefully that works. And if anyone's having problems, I'll jump around into each room just to make sure. So we're going to break out just for 10 minutes, focus on those questions and whatever else you'd like to discuss and think about for Lesley Ann, and then we'll come back into this main room. We will not be recording the breakout rooms, just so that you know. So I'm going to pause that now. Hi, everyone. Welcome back into the main room. I think we've got all of us here. I don't see any more rooms open. So thank you so much for participating. I know it's a short time to just get some thoughts flowing, but that's why we come back together. Hopefully you got to share a little bit about yourselves, as well as any questions or thoughts you had about both Lesley Ann's presentation and story, and maybe anything else. And now I will just help facilitate the question and answer period. So I don't see anyone who wrote questions in the section yet, but if anyone does have a question that you just want to say out loud, feel free to popcorn style just unmute yourself and go for it. Also, feel free to share about how those breakout sessions went. If anyone wants to go ahead.
I can go. Hi, I'm Maggie. I'm an engineering professor at a small liberal arts college, and I just taught like an inclusive engineering design class. And the future iteration of the class, I was hoping to work with different organizations. So I was really curious to Lesley and to hear more about like the inside outside class and how that went, and if there were any resources that I could learn about how that went. So, and I think someone else in the group also wanted to hear about it. So anything more about the class would be great.
Do I just start now, Victoria? Oh, wait. Okay. All
Yeah,
right.
go for it. Go for it.
So that class for me was really revolutionary, and we haven't written about it. So I have that on my to-do list to write about it. That class, we pitched it as an anthropology class because, so I did that class while I was at the D School at Stanford, and there were people within the D School who were uncomfortable about that us talking explicitly about that power shift. And we actually called the class first designing first world problems or something like that, because of course people want to design, no, solving first world problems, because of course people want to solve third world problems. And we wanted the class to be a little bit more obviously about that, having quote unquote third world people diagnose and solve first world problems. And people were uncomfortable with that kind of with that more explicit power relationship being apparent in the description of the class. So in the end, the class became about anthropology. There is a text that we used called The Body Rituals of the Nasi Rema, I believe. I'm putting it in the chat, which is an anthropology text that is talking about American life. And we started to use that to frame the class. And we said that the class then was set in among the Nasi Rema tribe. And then these other people, the consultants who were from Trinidad and Tobago, were then going to analyze life for this tribe called the Nasi Rema, and then see how they could, through design, solve something, right? Just to give you a little bit more of where we went, we didn't get to like problem solving. We stopped the class at like the empathy phase. It was just like a 2-week class about empathy. And the problem that the students in Trinidad diagnosed was actually about social isolation, which is interesting because actually that's what we thought that they would talk about. Because, like when you live in a place like Trinidad, Brazil, so many places in the world, you don't have the sense of loneliness that you end up having in in a place like Silicon Valley. I can't say all of North America, and the other professor and I, his name is Glenn Fajardo, we suspected that that's where the diagnosis would have ended up, and that's where it actually did come out, where the people in Trinidad were like, oh my God, these people are so lonely. We need to design things to make them connect with people and build community. And our class then ended with a lot of reflection, with the students in California talking about the experience of being studied, and then the students in Trinidad also talking. If we did that class over, we wanted to push it a little more so that the students in Trinidad had more to reflect on. But the reality is that we worked for Stanford at the time, and so we really put in a lot of energy into designing the experience for the students at Stanford. So yeah, that's where our class ended, with that kind of reflection, where the students at Stanford talked about, like how would they take this into other classes afterwards, that experience of being studied. I actually have like about 3 articles to write like now over the next couple of months. And so maybe it will become one of those articles. So I don't know. I mean, let's just stay in touch and I'll try to write something. Someone here has to keep me accountable. So I'll write something. But like, I think it will be one of the next articles that I write.
Just in case folks are listening and aren't looking at the chat, the question was just, when do you think you'll have documentation?
Yeah.
Does anyone else want to ask a popcorn style question, or should I read some of the questions in the doc? Feel free to just go ahead if you want to ask. Okay, I'm going to read the first one then. It says, curious to hear about class in D school and flipping the script so those who are underinvested are designing for those traditionally with power. How to facilitate, what did those with power take from the experience? And could this be applicable for corporate work? I will paste that into the chat now too for everyone to see. But that's for you, Lesley Ann.
Yeah, well, I think I summarized a lot of that. And so the biggest takeaway for the people with more power is that they said, oh, actually, being studied like this is uncomfortable. One student said that while they were doing the interviews, she wanted to hide the problem. Now, they didn't actually know what problem the students in Trinidad would hear or what they were looking for. But, when they were doing the empathy interviews, the students, in the post-reflection, the students said, I wanted to hide what I thought people would say would be a problem. So, it made them reflect on, oh, when they do work in other contexts, it just made them think about that whole thing of problematization, because another student reflected on and said, well, these people said it was a problem, but actually it's not a problem. And that's something that we have to remember in design, that, when we go into somebody's community and do this work and we say, oh, it's a problem that you eat X type of food, is it who says that this is a problem? Is it really a problem? So it just made them take that away. And I think it probably could work in corporate world. How I brought that into the practice that I do now at Tulane, and sadly, or not sadly, I don't know. This is my last semester at Tulane, so I mean, my work is going to change again, right? But how I brought it into Tulane is that, like, my last 2 semesters, because I'm shifting power, there's somebody in the community who has been dictating what my class is about, which is I'm comfortable with, because, when we started our relationship, the person said, you people at Tulane, you're always studying us in New Orleans. Here's what I really want your class to be about, and so that's how my class has been going, so I think that there are other places that we can do this, shift this power. The work that I'm doing with Dr. Bassano, we are shifting power in public health research, where we are designing community meetings where the community participants are ranking what they think the research organization should be studying, rather than the research organization saying, well, this is what we're doing because this is what our year is about. So there are other ways that we could flip that power. So I think there's another, are there other examples I've encountered of shifting design, education, and leadership? There are, I suppose. I'm an action researcher, and I don't do enough like literature reviews and like surveys of what else is going on in the landscape. So I know what other people do, and then if other people are like me and they don't write enough, then I probably won't know. But I like, my network is really big, so I'm friends with Antoinette, and I know sometimes I do her workshops. Another person who I'm good friends with is Tanya Anaisi. She's the main designer of the Liberatory Design Toolkit. And so, these people, we talk about the work that we do. Kind of, oh, my internet just disappeared, so I don't even know if I'm still on the call. I think I'm still here. Okay, good. Yeah. I'm in this space of kind of like trying to make radical change, where I'll bring the PhD into this. I'm like, having a PhD now gives me like the authority to say, I don't care what y'all are doing. This is what I'm doing, right? Which is, and I don't mean this like with with respect to like what the Nairobi Design Institute might be doing on Creative Reaction Lab, or I mean this like I can really break my relationship with the Bauhaus and traditional design education, and because I'm like, I'm Dr. Noel, so I'm gonna do what I want to do, and I'm not always as arrogant, but every now and again I have to be arrogant for me to be able to definitely say I am doing things this way. There's some days I want to be really nice, and then I end up watering down my perspective, and then there's some days I'm like, okay, no, this is who I am, and this is the way I want to try to shake things up. Other questions?
I can see some in the chat, but I'm gonna ask one that is a bit maybe different in the question and answer. You mentioned that your positionality allows you to push back against the tech bro centric design methods and cultures. Any strategies or tips for pushing these boundaries in your work and life? I just pasted it.
So I have really leaned into my outsider position, and I walk into every space and say, okay, I am a Black woman from the Caribbean. What are you doing for me? Kind of, and I'm not like the most militant person. Like Antoinette is much more angry than I am. And I mean, I say angry in a laughing way, but I think that there are ways, yes. One thing, I think by encouraging or having people talk about positionality all of the time, that's a strategy that you can use regardless of your own positionality. Like once people see who is missing, I mean, it doesn't work for everybody, but I found that it makes some of the conversations easier. So like when we do that positionality wheel, which is a visual thing, and people kind of say, when they can see it in front of them, oh, everybody in this class is 25 years old. And therefore they have to say, oh, that is in fact our position when we make a statement. I think that that's one way of kind of pushing back, where they see how homogenous the space is, and then they realize that, oh, we can't just design for tech, right? I don't know if that's such a useful answer, but that's why I bring that kind of conversation into every space that I'm in. The other thing that I'm starting to lean into a little bit more, Microsoft's inclusive design. They have 3 design principles. I don't remember principle 2 and 3 offhand, but the one that I remember most is about seeing exclusion so that you can then become inclusive. And so I have been trying to work with people. So like the same way I was trying to figure out, okay, how to get people to ask critical conversations. There's a thing of how do we see exclusion on any level, So like, I think Victoria, we were just talking about like time zone exclusion, or right now I have a student who's hearing impaired, and it will make me up my game so much because I have to think about how I'm excluding that person. When Sasha bought the deck of cards, I think, so I gave Sasha an early deck. And then after Sasha came back and bought a deck, and then when I looked through the deck, I had to say, oh my goodness, like the original positionality card, it talks about his or her. And then I had to go back and change the deck. So the deck changed immediately. But, so if we build that muscle of seeing where people are excluded, and that's normally a conversation that doesn't upset people so much. Because they could still retain their position as the person in charge or the person with the power or whatnot, but they can say, oh, we excluded X group, then that could be a way of pushing back on like that tech bro mentality.
And speaking of the card deck, the next question is actually about the card deck and asking what's next for the card deck. Are you planning on iterating on them, especially as the language changes and evolves over time?
Yeah, there's so many iterations planned. So, so actually, like, I've been using the deck kind of in the way that I teach. I think other people probably use the deck more than I do because I didn't want my students to feel that they had to buy this deck from me, right? So I actually have not used it in teaching a lot. But last semester I used it, and one of my students, I teach in a doctoral program at NC State, and one of my students, he is like a superstar author. His name is Will Lidwell. I just put his name in the chat. And a white male from his book is called Universal Principles of Design. And when I taught him, I said, well, I actually push back on universality all of the time, right? But when he critiqued the deck, he said, well, actually, this deck is about equity. So why? And he kind of put this seed in my mind. Oh, well, actually, I do have to create an equity deck. So that might be one of the other things that I do next. And I also want to push back on the idea that equity is something separate, because it really needs to be woven through everything that we do as designers. Um, but that's one of the projects, because I do so much reading that is specifically around inclusivity and equity. One of my projects is about, okay, really just focusing on equity, and creating a deck around that. And then there's some other projects that are really tangential but kind of interesting. Like there's a professor in economics from Virginia something, maybe Virginia State something. I don't know. I don't remember his university right now, but he's in economics and he wants us to collaborate on something to make economics language accessible to ordinary people. So that's another project that we're working on. And then I keep asking people to help me expand the deck, because the thing with the cards is that we had a limit to, because of production and costs and things like that, you're limited because you don't want the card deck to cost $6,000. But the apps and the website that host the information for the app have no limit. And, we keep asking people, well, send us new words. And actually, no one is really doing that. People are downloading the app, but nobody's really sending us stuff. But you see, that comes out of a certain philosophy where, and it's Freudian again, where we want people to break the deck, right? And tell us what's wrong with the deck and tell us what can be new in the deck. I will note that Islamophobia. And, the idea then is that we will be able to create like a whole glossary of critical vocabulary that could become, I don't know, just a handbook to get people interested in new terms. And it's all about vocabulary and language setting and expanding people's vocabulary, so that they could do different kinds of work.
Yeah, it's great. I can see I'm reading the ideas in the chat here. There's a couple more questions. There's one that's a little bit longer, but I'm also recognizing it's just a minute until 3. I didn't ask Lesley if you want to stay on for another 5 minutes or so, but if people do have to trickle out, please do. And thank you so much for being here. I'm gonna paste if you have time for one more question, Lesley.
Time, yeah.
Okay. So I'm pasting that question in the chat now, and I'll read it out. And then what I'm also going to do is just like a super quick, if anyone has feedback about today, I'll post this little survey that can ask you some questions. So feel free to do that when you have time. Okay. And I'll read the question for Lesley. Yes. How can the tools you introduced today, positionality, social impact, flipped approach in developed and developing narratives, liberatory methods developed by subaltern, inform public administration, and are you interested in connecting this research with governmental and multilateral practices? And how do you envision this process of designing new modes of public administration could unfold?
So that's a big question. And I guess maybe there are 2 answers, so I'll create the tools and sometimes I just move on, I move on to the next thing. The tools are still available. So like an example of that is how the alphabet exists, and I wasn't really using it in my own work. I mean, I use it. I worked with that language to create the deck, but I then move on to something else. So I mean, not quite to answer the question a little bit more directly. I have been interestingly working more and more in like public spaces, not necessarily creating tools to do this work with government. So like I worked with the city of Palo Alto to help them co-create conversations about equity. And I did some work in New Orleans to bring like community participants and residents and police into a space to get them again to co-create better experiences. So I'm doing this kind of work, and it's not necessarily always about tools. But maybe I could create tools to help other people to do it. It's like at the end of the day, I am in fact a designer, and I am really just using then the design process in a public space. And maybe if I created tools, other people would feel more comfortable, I don't know, trying to do stuff. I just experiment with a lot of stuff. I think that there's a space for us to get people in public administration to talk more about the future. And so like that's, maybe those might be the tools that I'd be interested in creating. But certainly the workshops that I do with people in public, in governance, often have a futuristic element to them. Like I'm often asking people, well, imagine, and this is then tied to the critical utopian action research that I showed you all at the start, with those 3 questions that I use with the children. But I'm often asking people, well, imagine we're in 2050 or we're in 2070, and now we're gonna, the world is perfect. What does this perfect look like? And I think that we could do a lot more. Some people don't like that kind of speculative element to government, or they think it's a little bit, they think it's like, what's the word they use? It's like it's running away from reality. But I like using that speculative element to give people a space to create where they don't have to worry about some of the barriers that exist today. So that's, yeah. You put something else on my agenda. I'll create a futuristic deck.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Lesley Ann, for being here. And thanks everyone else, all of you Design Justice members, for joining from all different parts of the world and time zones. It was amazing to have you all here today. As I mentioned, there's a quick like retro board if you want to give any feedback. Thank you so much to the volunteers of whoever was taking notes or screenshots and things for today. And a reminder that this was recorded, so it'll go up on the Design Justice YouTube channel for future reference or for folks who didn't make it. But yeah, thank you so much, everybody. And it was lovely being here with you all. And
Yes.
Thank you, Lesley Ann.
Thank you. And I mean, I'm in the Slack channel, so if anyone wants to reach out, and I'm easy to find, Twitter, LinkedIn, stuff like that. If anyone wants to continue conversations, feel free to reach out.
Awesome.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.